Welcome, everyone. My name is Jamie Fraser Tracy. I'm curator of collections here at the Wichita-Sedgwick County Historic Museum. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. We're going to have a great program. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker. Steve Friesen is the retired director of the Buffalo Bill Museum and Grave in Golden, Colorado, and contributing editor of True West magazine. He's the author of Lakota Performers in Europe, Their Culture and the Artifacts They Left Behind, and Buffalo Bill, Scout, Showman, Visionary. In his new book, Galloping Gourmet, available in the museum shop, Friesen explores an unfamiliar side of a familiar character in American history, William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. Steve is also a native Kansan and a dear, dear friend of mine, so please join me in welcoming Steve to the Historical Museum.
I think you even took my wife and me up in the tower here, right, at one point. I don't know if people get loud there anymore. Probably after they let me up, they decided no more. But anyway, let me get a drink here. Shall we wait for the clock to end to make sure it's exactly 2 o'clock? Exactly 2 o'clock. So there have been a number of Buffalo Bills over the years, and you're probably well aware of that. The most despicable of the lot was the serial killer in the movie Silence of the Lambs. You remember that? He took the name of Buffalo Bill. And at one point when I'm working at the museum, this young woman came up to me and said, "Why do you have a name for a museum after a man that was a serial killer?" And I thought, what? And I realized, oh yeah, that guy. And yeah, she had thought we had a museum for the Buffalo Bill, the serial killer. Well, over the 19th century and other times, there were other people that used the name Buffalo Bill. In fact, there was a guy that murdered somebody in Texas and claimed to be the Buffalo Bill, who was going around the country. In that time, he was doing stage shows and plays at opera houses. He wasn't doing the outdoor thing. And fortunately for Buffalo Bill himself, he was in California at the time. But people would do that. They adopt the name. Sometimes they just like the name. But there really were only 2 Buffalo Bills who, in my mind, legitimately deserved the title Buffalo Bill. And you're probably going to know about one of them at least. A local boy. Who was it? That's right, William Mathewson. So Mathewson, and again, you may know this, he got his nickname during the Kansas winter of 1861 to 62, when, as a buffalo hunter, he supplied meat to some of the settlers along the Arkansas River. I said it wrong, Arkansas River, my mistake. I'm so sorry. I was afraid I'd slip up. I've been in Colorado way too long. But anyway, I know, it's basically a square, almost a square border, and everybody inside knows how to pronounce it properly, and I slipped. The Arkansas River. Anyway, I'm not going to get into his later exploits on the frontier, but eventually he ended up here in Wichita in 1868 and became a banker and a business leader. And so that's William Mathewson. But the same year, 1861-62, that he was hunting buffalo in Kansas, there was another guy hunting buffalo in Kansas as well. His name was William F. Cody. 1868, when William Mathewson came to Wichita. Buffalo Bill started hunting buffalo and got that nickname, Buffalo Bill. He was supplying meat to railroad workers on the Kansas Pacific as they built the Kansas Pacific westward to Denver. And he was so efficient at it that the railroad workers gave him the nickname of Buffalo Bill. So you have 2 guys that are not too far off in the time that they're hunting for buffalo getting those names. Both of them hunted for meat. And at that time that they were hunting for meat, there were millions of buffalo on the plains. So they were not responsible for the decimation of the herds. That came later. That was the hide hunters. Buffalo hide was a very strong leather, and that hide was desirable for using on machinery in the factories back east, because that leather worked really well with all those pulleys and things that were used to run the machines. That's why so many buffalo eventually got killed, plus people are hunting them for sport and things like that. But Buffalo Bill himself, and I think Bill Mathewson might even have spoken up about they're concerned that the buffalo bill were being overhunted and they might become extinct. So there are some stories to the contrary about this, but Bill Mathewson was not upset with Buffalo Bill Cody for having the same nickname. Before Buffalo Bill Mathewson died in 1916, a 1911 newspaper article in the Wichita Eagle reported that he indeed held no grudge against Buffalo Bill Cody. According to Mathewson, I'm quoting this, "If he has been successful in commercializing my reputation, I only can say he is welcome." So I can just imagine him giving a sly grin to the newspaper reporter as he said that. So comparing the two, though, Mathewson was apparently a much better businessman than Cody, but Cody was a very good promoter. He was very good at publicizing himself. So to be frank, even in 1911, few people knew very much about Bill Mathewson, but Buffalo Bill Cody was by that time a world-renowned figure. So you have those two. Fortunately, despite maybe some of those stories that are out there, they got along pretty well with each other. So now that's behind us. So I've always been interested in at least two things. Buffalo Bill, who I was first introduced to at a young age, about age of 8. And about the same time, I was interested in cooking, and I was introduced to that. By the time I was 12, I had already subscribed to Gourmet magazine. And in high school, I enjoyed watching Graham Kerr, TV's Galloping Gourmet. When I retired after working at the Buffalo Bill Museum for 22 years, my attention turned to combining those two interests, Buffalo Bill and cooking. That led to 5 years of research and writing, resulting in Galloping Gourmet, Eating and Drinking with Buffalo Bill, the book that Jamie showed you and that we will be interrupting every once in a while to identify as an advertisement, so you will go down there afterwards, spend lots of money. Remember, Christmas is not that far off. Anyway, so Galloping Gourmet was not Buffalo Bill's nickname then or now, but it's a term that kind of reveals the Buffalo Bill that nobody knows. Everybody knows about the rodeo influence, about movies, a lot of other things. But nobody has explored this, hence my interest. Here's a quotation from the New York Sunday Tribune, 1894. "When you are at luncheon in the tent back of Buffalo Bill Cody's, you will get your first lesson, and particularly a delightful one. It is that Colonel Cody's table with the Wild West isn't Buffalo Bill's camp on the plains or in the mountains. With Colonel Cody, Mr. Salisbury, his partner, Major Burke, and other pale-faced chiefs, you find you are in a jolly company at a lavish feast." This is written in New York City in 1894 again. We don't particularly associate Buffalo Bill with lavish feasting and dining. But as that article points out, we expect to see him roughing it on the plains and dining around a campfire. And that was certainly how Buffalo Bill got his start, but eventually he became a gourmet, a galloping gourmet, if you will, who was as comfortable dining at Delmonico's in New York City as he was eating a venison steak out of a tin plate on a campfire. Today I will talk about how he became a gourmet, some of the people with whom he dined, and some of the food innovations he introduced, which he indeed did. I also try to dispel some of the myths about his drinking. There he is. So William F. Buffalo Bill Cody was born in LeClaire, Iowa on February 26, 1846. How about that? What's tomorrow? Tomorrow is his 178th birthday. So if any of you want to get a cake, candles and all that, and a fire extinguisher, you're welcome to do that. His earliest recollection of food was a mishap he had in Iowa when he stole some apples from the trees in an orchard near his home. As he crawled over the fence with his arms full of apples on his way out, the dog that was supposed to be watching the orchard came up and took a firm grip on his pants leg. And he managed to escape with the apples, but his pants were left behind in the grip of the dog. Several years later, he had another youthful encounter with apples of a different sort. He and a friend got into a barrel of hard cider that belonged to his friend's father and drank a considerable quantity. His sister Helen later wrote that he was, quote, in deplorable condition, singing and shouting mightily. The inevitable result of this binge was a bad hangover, and he reportedly never touched hard cider again in his life. That was not from whiskey, though, and we'll talk more about whiskey in Buffalo Bill later. It was his first taste of alcohol, and like I say, it did not discourage him from indulging in alcohol's other forms than hard cider later in life. When he was 8 years old, Will Cody's family moved to Weston, Missouri. Here's a shot of Weston, Missouri, right about 1854 when they moved there. 1854 was the year that they opened up Kansas Territory. So his family and other families were perched in Weston and along the east side of the Missouri, waiting to go across as soon as they said, okay, you could come in and stake your claim. And that's indeed what they did. But while they're waiting to go across the Missouri, he first saw his group of wagons ready to depart on the Oregon Trail, hundreds of them. And he looked at that and declared to his family that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to go just like those wagons into the great American West. Now in Weston, it was a booming river town. In fact, we can go back there and you can see you have a riverboat. You had a number of riverboats going in. If you ever go to Kansas City, see the steamship, what is it? Arabia, yeah. It's a wonderful visit. At any rate, so this was a town that also had a distillery. So there was a guy named Benjamin Holliday. He and his brother David opened a whiskey distillery in Weston. That distillery is still in operation in Weston, Missouri. It is oldest continuing operating distillery west of the Mississippi. And among other things, it offers white dog, which is highly flammable, so you can use it to start a campfire if you don't want to drink at all. Anyway, and that's very similar to some of the earliest products at Holliday's, but then they later on took the name McCormick's. Some of you may have even imbibed in McCormick's, probably in high school or something like that. It's not all that tasty. Anyway, and then he also later on introduced this special commemorative bottle, McCormick's did, of Buffalo Bill. And you see what you do to pour out the whiskey. You take his head off, and you pour it out through his neck. That's a weird kind of editorial thing there, isn't it? Okay. So young Will Cody's introduction to whiskey happened during his time driving wagons across the plains for Russell, Majors, and Waddell, who later started the Pony Express. Even though the company required abstinence, teamsters were usually hard drinkers, and they ignored that requirement and probably transported some of that Holiday whiskey, Ben Holliday's whiskey, with them when they left Weston. So after his father died, young Will became a breadwinner for the family, picking up jobs as a teamster on those wagon trains and fulfilling his dream to head into the great American West, into the great unknown. His mother ran a hotel back in the Salt Creek Valley where they had settled in Kansas. That's not far from Leavenworth. Domestic poultry was central to the family's diet. At that time, people rarely referred to breeds of chickens. Instead, they referred to the color of their legs. So you had black-legged chickens, white-legged chickens, blue-legged chickens, and yellow-legged chickens. The yellow-legged chickens were the most popular in this area. They were Dominiques, and you see some Dominiques here with their yellow legs. It was a breed introduced to the United States in the 18th century. They were hardy and self-sufficient, foraging for themselves, and they had rather heavy plumage that protected them from attacks by wild animals, that kind of thing. A coyote goes after them. If they have time to get up in the tree, the coyote might get a few feathers in its mouth, and that'd be about it. So the yellow-legged chickens were usually served to company, circuit riding ministers, in fact, many of the Methodists in particular. So this is very common. So when the minister was riding from town to town and on a Sunday would preach, they often prepared yellow-legged chickens as the chicken dish that they served. One Kansas newspaper noted rather sarcastically that a local ministers and laymen's institute was actually a society for the propagation of yellow-legged chickens. They took it that seriously. Well, Will's mother was a Methodist, so their home was often a destination for circuit riding ministers. His sister Helen remembered that Will, who was not very fond of sermons, would sometimes go out with his dog and scatter their yellow-legged chickens so they couldn't be captured. They'd go off into the woods, and he hoped that they would not be captured and the hungry minister would find a different home to have a meal and preach his sermon. Will later recalled that on one of his trips along the Oregon Trail, they were stranded at Fort Bridger, which is western Wyoming, for the winter. Food became so scarce they even killed their mules for meat. Went down to almost nothing by the end of winter. When spring came and they were able to head back east, they stopped at Fort Laramie, which is near the eastern border of Wyoming. He wrote, "Of course, we all had a square meal once more, consisting of hardtack, bacon, coffee, and beans. I can honestly say that I thought it was the best meal I had ever eaten." Hardtack lasted so long in those days, it would not spoil. It still survives. Some museums have 19th century hardtack in their collections. I have been to Civil War museums where they have hardtack left over from the Civil War. To make it easier to eat, because it was rather hard, you would put it in coffee to soften it up. That had the added advantage that if there were any weevils in the hardtack, they would float to the top of the coffee, and you could skim them off and throw them aside, unless you wanted the protein anyway, and then you could eat your hardtack. Now, because it was also used at sea, it was sometimes called pilot bread. And here, this is for all of you, and I don't think you have to worry about the weevils on this now. You can still get this from Amazon. Now they freeze dry it nowadays. So you get freeze-dried hardtack, Amazon. So in case you want to, put some aside for a rainy day, or, in case the floodwaters get too high or something like that. When the Arkansas River floods, right? Over the following years, Will Cody acquired his nickname of Buffalo Bill, as I said, as a buffalo hunter. During that time, he ate food made by U.S. Army cooks while he was a scout. So he would work as a buffalo hunter, and then he became actually a scout and a buffalo hunter for the Army. And he ate food from the U.S. Army cooks. But as a scout, he had an advantage over the enlisted men because he was going on ahead and he could hunt for wild game. Some of that wild game would come back for the men in the Army, but a lot of it he could eat as he was scouting. So he always had some access to wild game. He did supplement his scouting income with other enterprises, including a tavern near Fort Hays. That enterprise ended when the commander of the fort confiscated his entire supply of alcohol because it was unlicensed. Now, I won't get into details about it, but it's in the book, and in the book I talk about the specific kind of alcohol he was serving at the time, which gives you an idea not only what he was doing, but the kind of stuff that was available to people out at Fort Hays at that time. Surprising diversity of alcohol, which I think may still be available in Hays City anyway. So, in 1871, 25-year-old Will Cody was introduced to finer forms of eating and drinking on a hunt with General Sheridan and some wealthy New York City businessmen. The basics were not unfamiliar to him. They were often wild game, vegetables, and alcohol in its various forms. What set them apart was the time and thought given to their preparation and presentation. They were not just food, they were gourmet fare provided for those who he guided on hunts. Basically, we're talking about multimillionaires who could afford the best food, and in fact, they brought their own chefs along and had, a variety of preparations using wild game. So this feast that he had with Colonel Sheridan, or General Sheridan, was really one of his first gourmet feasts. It started out with buffalo tail soup. Then it had broiled Cisco and fried dace. Those are both fish you could catch in some of the rivers in the west, Kansas. Salad of prairie dog. That one's a little questionable. Stewed rabbit. Filet of buffalo aux champignons. Buffalo prepared with mushrooms, which is really quite tasty. Roasted elk. Roasted antelope. Black-tailed deer and wild turkey. Boiled teal and mallard. Ducks and antelope. Well, I said antelope already. Sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes, green peas. For dessert, they had tapioca pudding. Drinks were champagne frappe, champagne au naturel, whiskey, brandy, and Bass ale. I think they still sell Bass ale in England, don't they? Maybe they sell it downtown in Wichita too. At any rate, so this is a pretty gourmet feast for him, and this is his first experience of this. Then later on, Buffalo Bill accompanied a hunt that was done in western Kansas by the Grand Duke Alexis of Russia. He was introduced at that time to even more luxurious dining. They had a large tent for it where they consumed wild game prepared in various fashions, accompanied by champagne and foods that had been shipped from Chicago. Now here we see Alexis shooting his first buffalo. After that hunt, which occurred, I'm going to let ahead of myself. Let's stay up there for a minute. After that hunt, which occurred early in 1872, Buffalo Bill departed for points east, where he had discovered at that time that his reputation had preceded him. In fact, they were writing dime novels about his life already by that time. On his way to New York City by train, he made a luncheon stop in Cleveland at a depot dining hall, they called it. The imaginative report from the dining hall, which was shared with newspapers across the country, had him leaping 17 feet in the air, scalping a wooden cigar store Indian, also said he ate raw beef and cut his bread with a Bowie knife. I think much of that was not true. But in New York City, his host took him to fancy balls, teas, and dining experiences, which would become regular for him over the next part of his life. He was introduced to Delmonico's and later attended a banquet that was a cost per diner at the time of $100 each. Today, that would be over $2,000 per person at that. So it was a pretty fancy banquet. In late 1872, Cody was introduced to show business, and his life was never the same. He started out doing stage plays, basically melodramas, for a decade. How am I doing with the sound here? Is all right? Good. During that time, he lived out of hotels. Now, in those days, the best dining in a town was usually at a hotel, and he ate at some of the best. In Hartford, Connecticut, he stayed and ate at the Allen House, where he enjoyed oyster fritters, sauteed kidneys in port sauce, and leg of mutton in caper sauce. He also had oysters at the Hannes Oyster House in Hartford, which was one of Mark Twain's favorite eating places. In New York City, he stayed at the Sturtevant Hotel, or Sturtevant House. This is an envelope dating to the same year he stayed there. The hotel's restaurant was famous for its specialty, which was boiled pig's feet a la P.T. Barnum, because they were Barnum's favorite. Now, I'm not going to give you the recipe now, but it is in my cookbook. The cookbook, my book, I don't have it as a cookbook per se, it's a food history, but the appendix has over 30 recipes, period recipes from that time, with a little historical background on all of them, explaining why they're called, in that case, boiled pig's feet a la P.T. Barnum. But I won't tell you now, you have to buy the book. Anyway, or just read it in the back. If any of you are interested in that, if we haven't mentioned it already, they are available in the gift shop. I'm going to keep beating that dead horse the rest of the evening. With the creation of Buffalo Bill's Wild West in 1883, the nature of Buffalo Bill's dining changed again. He continued to dine in hotels when the show visited major cities, but most of the time he dined with the show. He didn't give up fine dining, though. He shared it with his employees. One reporter noted they received just as good meals as the highest liver at a first-class hotel. In other words, the biggest spender. That was no small order. The show started out with around 400 persons on staff, but over the years that number swelled until by 1910 there were 1,600 persons with the show. The food tent, you can see here, is almost, it's not quite almost, but it's about about quarter the size of the arena tent itself. The arena could hold over 10,000 people. So there are various configurations of the showgrounds. This is from 1906. That was very close to the largest that the show was. This is one of the 4th of July meals at the show. And you can see, and this is on the front of the book, you can see a bald, oh, here, that's right. There's Buffalo Bill. He actually took his hat off. You can see that he had a, there you go, a solar cell on the top. Anyway, but many of the pictures you see, he has a hat on or he has a wig as well. But in this case, he's relaxing. You see every table, though, is covered with, I've got the right button here. I don't want to actually turn it on. You can see they have tablecloths. Not only do they have tablecloths and some fine china, they have waiters. So they didn't walk through a cafeteria line or anything like this. They actually, all of the employees got wait service at the table. And that's for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was every day. Even though this is the 4th of July, this is the way they served them every day. The 4th of July, though, this is one, it was a very important holiday for the Wild West, both for patriotic and nostalgic purposes. The show was always on the road, performing, or even in the United States, but also in Europe. Here it is in Hungary. They're not home. 4th of July is in the center of the show season. So Buffalo Bill would throw a special banquet for the employees on the 4th of July. It was his favorite holiday. Christmas was probably his second. This is the menu from that's one from Szeged, Hungary, but this is the actual menu when it was in Lille, France in 1905, and you can see what they're eating. They have banana fritters and wine sauce. I have a recipe for the banana fritters in my book. Filet of beef with mushrooms. Got beef and mushrooms. What a great combination. At any rate, one other thing about 4th of July. After first playing the Star-Spangled Banner to open his shows in London in 1887, Buffalo Bill always opened his shows with that song. This was nearly 30 years before the Star-Spangled Banner was declared the national anthem by President Wilson. And I think it had a lot to do with the song's popularity, maybe even the reason we do it at the beginning of sporting events, because this was basically a kind of sporting event that Buffalo Bill was doing with the rodeo riding and things like that going on. So the Miert Tea Company provided the tea and coffee for that last 4th of July banquet. And that's become kind of a high point in the Miert Company's 250-year history. Miert was so pleased and proud that they did that, they even created a special Buffalo Bill tea that you can still buy today. You have to go to Lille, France, or Paris. So it's a good excuse to go either place. I have a friend from Belgium who brings them across for me every so often. The staff would serve good food and plenty of it. Annie Oakley, who joined the show in 1885, remarked that breakfast consisted of good coffee, bread, butter, preserves, fine steaks boiled over wood coals with fruits and berries in season. A summer lunch in New York, upstate New York, included rice and tomato soup, beef brisket and tomato sauce, cold roast beef and pork, corned beef hash, bread, coffee, milk, and iced tea. That same year, a summer supper in Hamilton, Ontario included baked, boiled, and fried fish, roast beef, roast veal and dressing, roast lamb, new potatoes, and new string beans. So they ate quite well, the employees did. Beef was a staple in the Wild West menu. It was consumed in all of its forms. Pork, lamb, chickens, and fish were all served and eaten at various times, but beef was central to all three meals. So if you wanted a steak for breakfast, you could have a steak for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner. You just tell the waiter, I want a steak. A visitor reported that a dozen cattle quartered and ready to cut in stews, roast, and soup bones are piled up together, looking like a mountain of meat, and it represents but one day's meat allowance. Everything was cooked in large quantities. Sorry, I have a dry cough. I'm going to throw in one of these home remedies here. There were 1 yard square sized meat pies, 350 tarts as big as your hand, one guy said. And for breakfast, 110 quarts of coffee and 125 quarts of tea. 150 pounds of bacon and 120 dozen eggs. That's one breakfast. The coffee was cooked in a 100-gallon pot. Again, one of the reporters said it was so large that 6 Indian warriors could dance a battle step in it. Maybe a little bit of exaggeration again. Here we see some of the cooks engaged in food preparation, cooking steaks over there. These guys are working on a soup probably. Here are all the waiters. and various people. Now there's a really interesting contraption on this lower left. See, I guess now that works as well as a red pointer. At the center of the food preparation, which the food prep area was a half acre, there was a range wagon. It was described as a monster range on wheels, or an altar of gastronomic hopes. You've already figured out that writers like to exaggerate in their things here. Once it was rolled off the railroad car and taken by a team of 8 horses to the showgrounds, it was positioned in the center of that half acre for food prep. The sides were lifted and propped up, and there was a massive cooking range with room for at least 4 and as many as 8 cooks on all its sides. The range was an assemblage of several ranges, so there are several wood-burning ranges there, all connected, and then they share a single smokestack. Again, talking about the newspapermen, some referred to it as a small Vesuvius, from which belched forth smoke and whence issued savory dishes heaped with meat and potatoes, which, as a Kansas boy, I love meat and potatoes. We all do. Unless we're vegetarians, then it's potatoes and potatoes. The area was fenced off from the curious public by ropes, although the food preparation could be observed from outside those barriers. Within the ropes, you see all these fires already, not only from the range, but they're doing small fires or smaller fires. For example, here they have those barrels filled with, in some cases, soup, water for boiling vegetables, water for heating water for dishwashing. There was also a massive refrigerator wagon and a water wagon as well. The operations of Buffalo Bill's Wild West behind the scenes were fascinating to people. They wrote about it, they came to visit it, but of course the main reason they were there was to see the Wild West, recreated, the American Wild West. And that's what they got. That was a central theme of the show. But as the years progressed, because this is operating 30 years, traveling the country, they start expanding it. So before long, the Cowboys and Indians are joined by a diversity of people and acts from all over the world. In fact, they referred to it as Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of Rough Riders of the World. As these changes were made, the show came to be described as, quote, a great school of anthropology. Well, you can just see a few of the different people even looking at this. Arabs, Gauchos, Cossacks, English Lancers, or Irish Lancers, I can't quite read it from here. That great school of anthropology was particularly evident in the dining tent, where, as one Englishman observed, the types of humanity depicted in the colored plates of a good atlas had suddenly left those pages to take a stroll into the tent where they shared a meal together. A diversity of humanity side by side, living in harmony and eating in harmony. So we have a diversity of ethnicities. There are people in this one from every continent of the world that he has recruited. Only continent not represented would be Antarctica. Penguins had too strong a union, I guess, or something like that, whatever. But at any rate, so that brings us to one of the Buffalo Bill firsts. In 1886, he introduced a new type of food to New York City. The food in the restaurant that he had at Madison Square Gardens was provided by the wives of 2 of the Mexican vaqueros. A reporter from The Sun, a New York newspaper at the time, joined Buffalo Bill and selected guests for a Mexican breakfast at the restaurant. The porter's posting in The Sun stated that, quote, nothing in it but the chocolate, which was admirable, was recognizable to the taste of the average untraveled New Yorker. He was unimpressed with the repast, noting that the tortillas tasted, quote, for all the world as the paste-soaked circus poster must taste to the ravenous goat. So all of you that love tortillas, I think you've just been insulted, who knows. He was also unimpressed by the henchalada, not enchilada, henchalada, which he warned looked like a rolled French pancake or crepe, but was a very different thing indeed. And those of you who have enchiladas notice there's a big difference between those and a crepe. Regarding the mezcal, he wrote that it has a combination of the flavors of gin, rum, and rhubarb. And, quote, In repeated doses, it is said to have the power of all the other intoxicants combined. No man can toy with it with impunity. So don't toy with your mezcal, huh? The Mexican Cafe was the first and last time Buffalo Bill's Wild West would offer an ethnic food concession, so I'm not sure just how popular it was. The Madison Square Garden effort did help introduce tamales to New York City. Within 8 years, tamale carts were found to be a rage throughout the city, and tamale parties were being held in a number of homes. Buffalo Bill did not realize it at the time, but he had not only introduced a new culinary offering to New Yorkers, but in 1886, his was the first Mexican restaurant to open east of the Mississippi. It was a challenge to the show's cooks to meet the dietary desires of all the show's performers as the show grew in its diversity. The Indians received steaks cooked to their satisfaction with no vegetables. You delivered them the vegetables, they'd send them back. The Cossacks loved pickled foods and were served pickled meat 3 times a day, or 3 times a week. The Sinhalese, who are natives of Sri Lanka or Ceylon, drank only water, no other coffee, tea, or no alcoholic beverages. They received food heavily spiced with pepper and plenty of rice with their meals. And the Arabs ate unleavened bread baked specially for them on certain days of the week. So these cooks with the show, in addition to having to serve over 1,000 people, had to also try and cater to some of the tastes of the different groups. There was one food that only the Indians truly liked, and it was something they cooked themselves just once per season. On that day, they had a dog feast. They believed that eating stewed dog meat once a year was for good luck. The meal was celebrated as a holiday and a break from their ordinary diet. It was carried out quite openly and frequently reported on in the newspapers. A few reporters joined the feasts, but did so with a certain level of disgust, which is what my wife confronted me with when I told her I was going to include this in the book. She was quite disgusted. She loves dogs, but it's the way it was. Now, even if the reporters, and my wife, didn't care for dog feasts, the press and invited dignitaries, particularly in Europe, greatly enjoyed the Western meals that were staged by Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Often the meals featured what they called rib roasts of either buffalo or beef. The rib roasts were usually special events staged by the show's marketing manager, John Burke. One or more large ribs of the roast beast, were roasted by the American Indian members of the show over an open fire, then cut into chunks, which were impaled on sharpened on both ends. And one end has the big old chunk of beef that they've just roasted. The other end is driven into the ground, and they would invite their honored guests to come sit at benches, and if they wanted to eat the beef, they had to pull, each one had a stake, they could pull the stake, S-T-A-K-E, out of the ground and eat the meat off of it. No utensils provided. No table, no fork or knife. This was regarded with great glee by many of these so-called civilized Easterners, Londoners, and people like that. Oh, how delightful. It's the Western style of eating. I don't think it was, but it certainly was an imaginative way of treating their special guests. Each diner was also presented with a tin plate and a small glass, so the plate could have some fresh vegetables, radishes were often popular, and a tasty liquor. Thomas Edison did a lot of business with Buffalo Bill. The relationship began when Buffalo Bill threw a Western breakfast honoring him at the show that they held during the Exposition Universelle in Paris. That was in 1889 when the Eiffel Tower was first opened. Buffalo Bill and Edison were among the first people to go up in the Eiffel Tower once it was opened in 1889. It was almost a brunch, really, more a brunch. It included clam chowder, sole, the fish sole, quail on toast, steak with mushrooms, chicken, corn, hominy, biscuits, cornbread, and baked potatoes. Dessert was pumpkin pie, apple pie, mince pie, watermelons, pears, peaches, grapes, peanuts, and popcorn. Edison later said it was one of the high points of his visit to Paris. During his first trip to Europe, and that was in 1887, Buffalo Bill dined with the Prince and Princess of Wales. British Prime Minister Gladstone, Crown Prince Wilhelm of Germany, and many other celebrities and royalties in Great Britain and on the European continent. He was also invited out to many banquets and parties. He joined famous English actor Henry Irving and writer Bram Stoker at several banquets. Who's Bram Stoker? Dracula, the writer of Dracula. Actually, a little sidebar on this, one of the characters in Dracula is probably based on Buffalo Bill. He also had tea with Oscar Wilde when they were in London. During his lifetime, he dined with all sorts of famous people, luncheons, parties, and banquets. He dined with artists like James McNeill Whistler. Whistler reportedly was going to do a portrait of Buffalo Bill, but I guess he decided to paint his mother instead. Then you have Albert Bierstadt, also a famous Western painter. Frederick Remington, a Western painter. Rosa Bonheur, we don't know much about her, but she was a very famous French artist at the time. When in Washington, he also lunched with presidents like President Grant. After a meal with Cody, Theodore Roosevelt said that, quote, Buffalo Bill has always been a great friend of mine. And indeed, he went on the stump, or he endorsed and helped promote Roosevelt when he ran for president after Philly, and he was the vice president when it was Cleveland that got shot, right? No, McKinley, sorry. Wrong guy. I know, so some historian. Was Cleveland shot too? Some of those, no, I won't go there. Okay. As his Buffalo Bill persona became one of the best-known figures of his time, William F. Cody found himself an influencer, to use a term from today. His opinions on current issues were sought out and could be read in the newspapers. He was able to speak out about things that mattered to him, like equal rights and the vote for women, equal rights for the Indians, conservation of wild areas, conservation of the buffalo. The dinner table, as well as the printed page, became a forum where he could trade ideas with the influential people of his day, from artists to military figures, captains of industry, and of course, as I've already mentioned, presidents. Incidentally, he did know Grover Cleveland. But anyway, in addition to his ingenious range wagon and opening the first Mexican restaurant in New York City, Cody also introduced other food innovations on his trips to Europe. So, visitors to the 1887 American Exposition in London, which celebrated the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria's reign, walked across a bridge. So here's the exposition. Here's a bridge. They will walk there, and there is the arena. There is the arena with Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Now, all along the back of this arena was the world's largest bar. It was a total of 700 feet in length and was said to be the biggest in the world. American bartenders were imported to provide the cocktails. There were 400 different kinds of cocktails, supposedly. Now, one of the other parts of this is the British did not drink cocktails at the time. In fact, the cocktail is kind of an American invention dating about the 1840s. And by 1887, they're fairly common in the United States, but they're not drinking them in Britain or in the rest of the continent. Part of the reason was, if you've traveled, at least used to be if you traveled in Europe, you couldn't get ice. It's that you wouldn't get ice with your water. You had to ask for it. If you were lucky, you might get it. Nothing was iced. Cocktails are built around, among other things, ice. So, here you see it. You can see the, there it is. So just real thin there, it says. Passage and then something bar. Yeah, I can't read it either. Anyway, so it's hard to read, but I think it's in the book. Anyway, one of the things is, while this did not introduce the cocktail to Great Britain, there were a few places people might have had them, but this popularized the American cocktail. One reporter wrote, "Straight drinks are the rule here, and they know nothing more about mixed drinks." Newspapers noted the American cocktails became a rage during the exhibition. Even the Princess of Wales and other royals patronized the bar after enjoying the Wild West. Over the following years, a wave of American bars opened in London and elsewhere. 2 years later, it was observed that no London restaurant could be complete if it did not have an American bar with shakers, lemon squeezers, and lots of crushed ice. since, this is a quote from that time, no American bar would be of any account without its ice, a necessity of life to the large majority of Americans. It is, isn't it? When we travel in Europe, we're always ordering ice with our water, with everything. Some of those American bars that were started then are still in operation, the most notable being the longest operating American bar in Europe at the Savoy Hotel in the Savoy in London. The Savoy also has the singular high point or whatever of being the only road, the road that goes to it, the only road where you drive on the right side of the road. Everywhere else you drive on the left because they're all wrong, except for the people that run the Savoy, I guess. So this is a receipt for popcorn. They bought a lot of popcorn. Popcorn was a very popular concession at Buffalo Bill's Wild West. This is an order made in 1893. While they toured the United States and when they went to England and Europe, they sold popcorn at the concession stands. When the show was in France, newspapers wrote this news: Buffalo Bill is teaching Paris to eat popcorn. After the show left, popcorn continued to be sold at concession stands at the theaters in Paris. When the show got to Germany, popcorn was still being sold, but with a new twist. Show visitors who tasted it were heard to exclaim, "Why, it's maize and honey." Maize, of course, being, it's not the maize we grow here. Real cool, that's a term for corn. They were also called American bonbons. They were wrapped in silk paper. What were they? Sugared popcorn balls. What none of us wanted for Halloween. You remember when they used to give those at Halloween? I always wanted a Hershey bar. Anyway. Well, there is one. There's a couple of them. Okay. In 1897, 5 years after the first tour of Europe concluded, a writer remarked that it was Buffalo Bill's Wild West that first introduced the trendsetters of Europe to cornbread, corn cakes, and all that could be made of corn. He stated that Cody, quote, thus indirectly created a market for American corn, which has resulted in the sale of millions of bushels. He suggested that all other contributions that Cody made in terms of introducing American life to Europe paled in comparison to this, and that few others had done more for America than Buffalo Bill did when, quote, his hospitality introduced American corn to the cities of Europe. Now, whether one agrees with that part, it was popcorn, cornbread, American cocktails, and many other foods shared with its show's European hosts and Cody's Western meals that provided an important social cement connecting Europe and America. Just a moment. Well, I can't conclude without bringing up and discussing what we might call the elephant in the room, Cody's drinking. His relationship was as complicated as his relationship with his wife. And that is a topic for another lecture. There's not time to go into that here. Or we can chat about it later. As I already mentioned, he was probably introduced to whiskey during his early trips across the plains as a wagon teamster. For the first 2 decades, he was not unlike other frontiersmen who were hard drinking. This continued into his years as a scout when on one occasion the cook at Fort McPherson in Nebraska, not far from North Platte, sent him and a fellow scout into North Platte to get supplies. The two instead purchased a 5-gallon demijohn of brandy, 2 cases of Old Tomcat gin, and an undisclosed amount of whiskey. The cook was extremely angry when they came back with those and no other food supplies. But then they shared the whiskey with the fort's officers, and all was forgiven. Old Tom Gin got its name from the tomcat on the gin's labels. You can see here is actually a Burnett, Robert Burnett, which is a popular gin back at that time. And here's the Old Tom Gin, a label off of one, and there's your tomcat. It's a slightly different gins than you get nowadays, although they are reviving Old Tom Gin in a few places. I don't know if they've revived it in Kansas yet. Buffalo Bill continued to drink as he entered show business, and on at least one occasion was accused of being drunk while performing in one of his stage plays. That's before he started the Wild West. But when he started the Wild West, he had a partner named Date Salisbury who insisted that Cody refrain from drinking during the show season, and Cody agreed. In fact, he was so careful not to drink that General Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, put his image on a banner as an exemplary model of temperance. He was a strong supporter of women's rights and often spoke out about it, but he did not get on board with the temperance movement. He expected them to take his image off of that, and he knew full well that when he would get together with his friends after the show season was over, he'd probably go on a bender. He also had no problem with advertising alcohol in his show programs, as you see here. That's an ad from 1901. He insisted, though, that when the season was over, he drank for recreation, and that enabled him to throw off, quote, thoughts of work and labor for the time being. That was his particular excuse. Now, from what I can gather, reading all about it, firsthand accounts from people who knew him, people who might have seen him occasionally drinking too much, I would say that he was a drinker, but he was not a drunkard. He was not an alcoholic in that sense. If, he did do some drinking, there's no question of that. But as the years went by, he drank less and less, and he stuck with his promise to remain moderate to Nate Salisbury. In fact, he never drank at all when he was with the show. So you have 30 years. For at least 6 months of every year, he did not drink a drop. Then after the show, he might go on the occasional bender. But by 1904, he wrote to a close friend that he had only drank alcoholic beverages 3 times before since 1901. Then in 1905, he had a personal spiritual awakening, and he wrote his sister Julia that he decided to stop drinking entirely. He was particularly fond of ginger ale, however, as a substitute. So here's a bottle of ginger ale from right around that same time. Well, as Buffalo Bill's health deteriorated over the next 3 years, so that's from about 1913, 1914, his appetite deteriorated as well. This is the last photograph of him taken in Glenwood Springs. It shows a very gaunt man on his way to die in Denver. This was taken in 1917. And he died just a few years later after he visited, a few days later after this, on January 10, 1917. As you can see, his appetite has pretty much left him. So, Buffalo Bill's food legacy. He has a very obvious food legacy, perhaps more in Europe than here. There is the Munich Cowboy Club, which was inspired by Buffalo Bill's Wild West and the writings of German author Karl May. The club opened in 1913, and with a brief interruption during World War II, has operated ever since, offering whiskey, American whiskey, and saloon. And I might point out that there's a teepee on the site, and they serve my wife and me barbecued beef, baked potatoes. I think we got some cornbread, too. But it's a little weird to be in the center of Munich and eating in a teepee. There's also the Cafe Greco in Rome, which shows off images of Cody from when the show was there in 1906. And members of the show came to the cafe and had coffee. So there is this thing where they are linking Buffalo Bill in many ways to food. And just up the Mediterranean, France's Buffalo Grill chain offers Wild West food. And here's a pin. You can see his visage, his face, on the Buffalo Grill title. In Hungary, a Buffalo Bill Western-themed restaurant bears his face over its entrance. And while in England, if you're there, you can visit Buffalo Bill's Cafe that offers Tex-Mex food. For nearly 30 years, Disneyland Paris staged a Buffalo Bill Wild West show's dinner theater, featuring foods from the American West twice a day, seating 2,000 people for each show until it closed due to COVID in 2020. It began with cornbread and chili, followed by Texas beef, potato wedges, and finished with an apple dessert. All that very American. The cornbread is part of that Buffalo Bill legacy in France, where he promoted it during the show's 1889 visit in Paris. And in fact, I visited the show here at Disney, and we had a young lady, because I had helped them with an exhibit. She was our hostess, and she says, now we're going to have something really unusual. And they served me cornbread. And I was like, oh, thanks, that's very nice. My daughter just made it last week. But at any rate, it just gives you an idea. Corn still doesn't have quite the regard, I think, that maybe some of the folks hoped back in Buffalo Bill's day, but you will find more corn-based things in Europe than you used to. So Buffalo Bill has been certainly commemorated throughout the world as one of the best-known characters in American history. His name has appeared on eating and drinking establishments throughout the world. There's a bar in Thailand with his name on. There's a steakhouse in Zimbabwe. Then there's exotic places, Wyoming, like in Wyoming, where they have Buffalo Bill-related places. The Sheridan Inn in Sheridan, Wyoming, Buffalo Bill helped manage that for a while. It has fine dining and a bar. The Irma Hotel, and that's where this photo is taken, was built and owned by Buffalo Bill. Popular destination for breakfast and dinner. You can even order Buffalo Bill beer at the bar. The Buckhorn Exchange in Denver, Colorado, found in 1893, was a frequent watering hole for Buffalo Bill, and something that the restaurant proudly acknowledges, and they named one of their drinks after him. Then up on Lookout Mountain, where he's buried, where I worked for 22 years, his foster son, Johnny Baker, who was a marksman with the show and helped manage it later on, opened Pahaska Teepee on Lookout Mountain in 1921, four years after Buffalo Bill died and was buried up there. It offered dining, a gift shop, and a museum. In 1979, a different building was erected for the museum, but the gift shop and cafe still are operating in that 1921 building. It continues to offer services to visitors to Buffalo Bill's grave, helping perpetuate his legacy. So this is my favorite painting of Buffalo Bill. In it, we see a man who not only scouted the Great Plains, but also looked forward to and influenced the future. His legacy is large, influencing everything from show business. Why were the earliest movies cowboy and Western movies? He helped popularize that idea as a crowd pleaser. So some of the earliest movies were about the West. Rodeo, but then he also influenced European and American foodways. So next time, as you enjoy a nice meal at your favorite restaurant here in Wichita, raise a glass to Buffalo Bill, America's original Galloping Gourmet. Thank you. Yes, the last advertisement, and you've been reminded about this enough, but I'll just leave it up there for the Q&A session. Actually, no, let's leave that. That's a nice one. So, questions. A guy who painted this picture is the question. A guy named with the last name of Papacina. He was an Italian artist. I have looked all over for more about him. This is the only thing I have found painted by Papacina, but it is a rather iconic image that they used on some of Buffalo Bill's posters that he used to advertise the show, and there have been other people that have reproduced that image in the years since. So it's a very important image in terms of Buffalo Bill's Wild West and his legacy, but the Papacina legacy outside of this, I have no idea. Yes? All men and only one woman sitting next to Buffalo Bill. You notice that. I'm saying that for the benefit of our watchers. That's a tough one to answer. I'm not sure why. Because Buffalo Bill paid the women equally to what he paid the men. He really promoted women and women's rights. Maybe it's just the way it fell out that day. By the time that was taken, that photo was taken, Annie Oakley was no longer with the show. Because while Annie would have been with the show, I'm sure she would have sat very close to him, one way or another. But I can't speak to that. But there were a number of women who worked for him over the years who all spoke about his respect and his concern for women's rights, including Annie. So did I deflect some of that fairly well in terms of he's no misogynist there, not at all. Okay, good. Anything else? Well, any other questions that may be in the back of your mind may be answered by yes. That book, which is on sale down at the gift shop, and all the proceeds, the profits go to the museum, right? So there you go. Thank you again, and we can talk, and I can sign, and et cetera later.